Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 46 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, again, we're back in the revised and expanded letters this series. This time, we're focusing on letters around the time of the Lord of the Rings, or at least a little after. At least that was the intent. As we'll find out shortly, most of those letters were published in the original version. And we're going to soon be moving on into 1957 and 58 and well beyond the publication of The Lord of the Rings. But for the rest of this series at any rate, I will continue to look only at those letters that are talking about his works. We'll come back and look at family letters in another series. Now, last time we wrapped up with letter 168a as Tolkien needed a vacation from his vacation and expressed his fondness for the Welsh people and language. Today, since we're only looking at the new and updated letters, we're going to start by moving forward to letter 179c, where we start to get a hint as to what Tolkien is still working on. Now, he's writing to Rainer Unwin on January 5th, 1956. It's not quite 3 months after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. He writes, "I have had no time at all for the Silmarillion, but perhaps term will be easier once the administrative rush is over and lectures are in order." And then he takes a little bit of time to express his appreciation to Rainer, thanking him for his congratulations on the completion of The Lord of the Rings, and saying, "But for all your kindness and help, and your support before there were any plaudits, and without which there would have been none." Sometimes it's easy to forget just how many things had to happen for us to have Middle-earth as we know it. Next, we're going to move ahead a bit to letter number 187, a draft to H. Cotton Minchin. Now, Tolkien noted on the draft, more or less as sent 16th April, with some reduction. Speaking of reduction, this letter was in the original edition, but it has been significantly expanded, almost doubled in length. So we're going to go ahead and cover some of that new material. First, he talks again about his work on the Silmarillion and his desire to see it published. Minchin had apparently made a suggestion we can infer from Tolkien's response. "It was indeed an idea I myself once had, to publish a special volume of material for specialists. Even then, under the shadow of the risk of the great production costs, it was not ill received by Allen and Unwin, and would now, I think, be a practical possibility. Indeed, the chief objection is the labor involved on my part, and the weight of other duties which still occupy most of my time." This is an interesting idea indeed for Tolkien to have perhaps published the Silmarillion as a volume for specialists. I mean, after all, in a way, that's kind of what ended up happening. As much as many of you watching and listening love the Silmarillion, I'd be willing to wager that most readers of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit haven't read that specialist volume. And he seems to think, and probably rightly given the sales success of The Lord of the Rings, that Allen and Unwin would at least consider it. But he comes back once again to the lack of time. In fact, the next paragraph of the letter gives us a taste of what it is that's getting in his way. "I should be retiring in July 1957, and he put that in air quotes, by the way, and could then apply myself to the one branch of history and philology which I am especially devoted to. But alas, in lieu of a pension, my university has merely elongated my professorial life. Also, my philological colleagues and critics are now turning on the heat, as I believe they say in Mordor. They are kind enough not to refer, except behind my back, to my disgraceful action in becoming literary, and publishing a large, unprofessional, popular work. But they cry, 'We know what you have been doing all these years. Why the addition of this and the commentary on that and the grammars and glossaries have all remained promised but unfinished. You have had your fun, and you must now do some work.' So, stricken in conscience and caught in several actually binding commitments, I find myself shorter of time than ever." I can only imagine what it would have been like to become a bit of a professional pariah because you've written something deeply popular. After all, that's not academic. And though Tolkien was always diligent to do his work, at least from what we read in the biographies and the chronology and the letters, spending only his spare time really on the legendarium, his colleagues felt shorted somehow. And now, instead of retiring, he's having to continue to work and taking on even more work out of a stricken conscience. Now, he also adds a bit about maps in this letter that's definitely worth reading, and it goes along with something that we've read before in another letter. I wisely started with a map and made the story fit. That comes from 144. In this letter, he writes, "Maps take a great deal of time. It is, of course, impossible to make a map to an invented story. The story must be made to a map. That system I naturally adopted, and though inevitably some inconsistencies and inaccuracies crept in the course of a long labor constantly interrupted, needing adjustment either of text or map, the geography remains, I hope, basically sound. Now, this idea of starting with the map and making the story fit instead of the other way around is, I think, one of the key reasons why Tolkien is able to so successfully maintain that secondary belief. Then Tolkien continues to talk about maps, explaining the difference between a map that he could use and one suitable for publication, saying there is a wide gap between a working map, rough if accurate in scales and distances, useful to the narrator, to whom a dot is often enough without a name, and one drawn and lettered passably enough for reproduction. Now, then the letter moves into the part that was published originally, before we get another lovely paragraph about the Silmarillion, where he writes, "Personally, I desire first of all to put into order the Silmarillion, together with the cosmogony and the legends of the Second Age, the downfall of Numenor." Now, as an aside, when he says Silmarillion in this context, he's talking about what we know of as the Quintus Silmarillion. That's the bulk of, but not all of, the book titled the Silmarillion. Those other elements that he mentions make up most of the rest of the book. What he calls the cosmogony here is known in the Silmarillion as Ainulindale, and the downfall of Numenor is simply Akallabeth. Now, Tolkien continues in the letter, "All of these were written first, and it was my desire to issue them in chronological order. It would have lightened The Lord of the Rings, but it was only as a sequel to The Hobbit that publication proved possible. Bless the little people. Anyway, The Lord of the Rings has astonished me, and I believe the gallant publishers still more." Bless the little people indeed. He goes on to say the books are selling very well indeed, though he laments that Her Majesty's Treasury will naturally pocket most of the proceeds, unearned, since the fact that I have labored and sacrificed other emoluments for 18 years, unremunerated in the production of this work, moves them not at all. Their commission even recommends that the permission to spread profits over 3 years should be withdrawn from authors. I think we'll get to some more complaints about taxation again soon, but yeah, it's bad here. He even relates to mention an anecdote about a fellow author who, Tolkien writes, finally succeeded in retaining £4,000 only out of 74,000 produced by his book. Ouch! Finally, the letter concludes with some etymology on the recipient's name. H. Cotton Minchin. And he notes Cotton with approval and pleasure, before explaining that he sees Minchin as a variant on the surname Nunn, since it is a modern spelling of the Anglo-Saxon word for a nun, surviving in such place names as Minchinhampton. He also talks about getting a letter from Sam Gamgee, a genuine person of that name who seemed surprised, before ending with a quote that you will likely recognize as included in Carpenter's biography, where Tolkien explains that his Sam Gamgee is indeed, as you say, a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates and batmen I knew in the 1914 war, and recognized as so far superior to myself. For now, folks, that wraps it up for this week's Tolkien Tuesday, but be sure to join me again next week for more Letters from Tolkien. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what I talk about. You'll also be able to support the show, get an ad-free feed, and a bonus episode every week. And then join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.